Good evening, everybody. This is so much fun. I mean, if you're watching Bridgerton, you should be reading C.S. Harris, whose books are dramatically better plotted, and the characters are, I think, completely engrossing. And we are at book 17 with When Blood Lies. And the only reason I'm not showing it to you is that Candace has kindly signed them at home and shipped them to us, but they're not here yet. And I read a printout. So I can't show it to you, but we should have the signed books in tomorrow or Wednesday. So thank you very much for doing that, Candace.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's so much nicer when she's here because then we go out and we geek around in the Regency period. We have lunch, we do all kinds of things. So I'm hoping by next year she'll be able to come back and spend time with us again. But meantime, we have Zoom. So one of the things, well, let me say first, she writes this series as C.S. Harris, but I'm going to call her Candace because just calling her C sounds like her in a James Bond movie or something. So that's who she is, C.S. Harris, known to me as Candace. And I see, it tickled me again, Candace, looking that 17 books and every single title starts with a W word. So you started out with What Angels Fear in 2005. Did it become a thing right away or did it sneak up on you?
Well, I had the titles for the first four, and I thought, well, this it would be a way to join the books of the series together. I never dreamt I'd be doing 17 of them. I was thinking at the time maybe 8 or something like that, 8 or 10. So it's just one of those. At first I thought maybe I was going to run out of title ideas, but they seem to keep coming. So
well, there's the when word and the why word and the where word and the who word and a what word twice. So they're all those hallmarks of journalism. Who, where, when, what, and why. So so it works out for you. This is the other thing that I so love about this series, which I have read in real time since 2005, is that every book has its own mystery that is resolved, but there's a gigantic overall story arc, and we're not anywhere near done with it. We've explored so many aspects of Sebastian St. Cyr's family, his career, his relationships, and as I said, it never descends into soap opera. It's always wonderful. And yet I have to say that you're pretty good about not giving us super cliffhanger endings.
Well, I try not to leave them too bad. I mean, sometimes there's a little bit that isn't answered, but as a reader, I don't like a really bad cliffhanger ending at the end of the book. So I don't like to do it to my readers.
Well, what you do is you wrap up the plot, the specific mystery plot in each book, but the larger issues in Sebastian's life continue. And, when we first meet him, he doesn't know all that much about, or he doesn't know nearly as much as he thinks he knows about his family, about his parentage, about his dead mother, about who his sisters might be, if any. And so it's changed over time. And I think Hiro, who's Sebastian's wife now, there are going to be some spoilers in this if you haven't read the entire series from the beginning. I think Hiro is one of your very best characters next to Sebastian. And yet when we started out, she wasn't necessarily the object of romantic interest to Sebastian. In fact, she was an antagonist, wasn't she?
She was, yeah. Although I did always intend for her for them to end up together, but yeah, I think she's only in a couple scenes in the very first book, and then it expands as pretty rapidly as it goes on. But I loved the idea of having her as his wife, because her father is his nemesis, and so she's in a very delicate situation. She's a very strong, intelligent woman. And so she has this balancing act between these two men she loves, her father on the one hand, who is this pretty ruthless character, but she still loves him. And then her husband on the other hand, and she has to find a way to balance those two loves.
Well, and Sebastian, meantime, is trying to balance his relationship with Lord Hendon, who is his nominal father. And he is constantly on a quest for what the fate of his mother, whom he believes 20 years ago when we, well, not so long ago when we start, but anyway, over time has is missing and presumed dead. But one of the great things about historicals is you don't have to age anybody in real time, do you? Because they're already aged. So you haven't had to like do every book as a new year in Sebastian's life. He hasn't really gotten that much older, has he?
No, I think it's 4 years. This one's a little over 4 years after the beginning. And yeah, that's nice. And it's also nice that I don't have to deal with changing technology or pandemic masks. How do I fit those into the story? It's all in the past, and I can advance each story. With some of them, I think started just like a week after the last one. So I think the longest one had a span of, I think, 8 months between one book and the next. So yes, it's definitely easier. I wrote a series of 3 thrillers under a different name, and they were set in New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina hit and wrecked the city. So anytime you're dealing with contemporary, it's easy to just end up with problems. It's like, oh, how do I handle that?
So if any of you watching this have never read one of the excuse me, previous 16 Sebastian St. Cyr, I have said in promoting this book that you can read this one as a standalone. You will have some character spoilers, but what this book is really about, which I found truly amazing, and Candace, I learned so much from you, is that they're in France. And so we're in that period where Napoleon is on Elba, but it's beginning to look like he's not going to stay in Elba. And then he does in fact leave Elba and advances towards Paris and all the things that go on there. And, we read about Waterloo and we read about how he got to Elba, but I don't think that very often we read in this kind of detail about his return to France, how he did it, his motive. How he did it was the British were actually completely inept, which I found fascinating. How did you find out that Lord Wellington inadvertently financed his return to France? I love that.
It was one of those little footnotes in history when I was reading about the building that his sister had lived in, and it's just, oh, kind of by the way, this is where all that gold came from. That part of it was really fun because I knew a little bit of the story of Napoleon's escape, but I didn't know it in detail. I'll be the first to admit that, even though I used to teach it. But it was like one of those things you sort of skipped over. And it is a fascinating story because it's one of those things that in history people didn't think was going to actually happen. So when they heard that he had escaped and he'd landed in the south of France, he had hardly anyone with him. He just, less than 1,000 men, and people laughed and said, "Oh, well, he'll be stopped. They'll hang him." And he kept getting closer and closer to Paris, and they still kept saying, "Well, it's not going to happen," until he was practically at the gates, and then all of a sudden they went, "Oh my God, he's coming!" And so I think there's this human tendency that if something is unbelievable, we just think it's not going to happen. And it takes us a while to accept the fact, kind of like the pandemic, because I was writing it at that time. And it reminded me of that we saw that the pandemic was happening in China, but for some reason, I at least didn't really grasp the gravity of what was going to happen when it actually hit us. And so writing this book at the same time was kind of fascinating for me.
Actually, you wrote it before Putin invaded the Ukraine, the Ukraine. But this book is scarily contemporary in how Napoleon and what's going on with him parallels Putin and what's going on with him. And there's some really tough questions here about loyalty, about patriotism. Marechal Ney, for example, Marechal is like the generals in Napoleon's army. And, he's taken a oath of loyalty to the Bourbon king, the restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII. And yet when Napoleon is marching towards Paris, he has to make a decision. He has troops under his command. Is he going to honor his oath to the Bourbon king on the throne? or is he going to honor his original oath to Napoleon? And, the damage that does to families and relationships and, the whole fabric of society. And yet, two of the things I really loved about this was, one, the implacable ambition of Napoleon. I mean, you put down his escape from Elba and his return to France in large part from boredom, which makes you think the British could have done a better job in figuring out what to do with him on Elba. But the other is the Duke of Wellesley, who, many people revere. And it turns out, I sort of knew this, that he's a terrible husband and not a good father. And yet, he was a brilliant general and defeated Napoleon at the last minute at Waterloo and went on to become Prime Minister of England and other things. So you do illustrate the fact that powerful military and political figures, leaders, can be real shits in real life.
Yeah, there's a tendency with people who we see as heroes to overlook the other aspects of their character and assume that if they're sterling in one sense, that they must be in others. And and as you're saying before too, that was an whole aspect of Napoleon's return that I hadn't considered, was the damage and the real agony that so many people in France went through. Who am I going to be loyal to? And I actually have a book that's a collection of letters and they really did go through agony. Which way were they going to go? And the ones who went with Napoleon ended up, regretting it. A lot of them were executed by the Bourbons when they came back in power. And because it's a dilemma that you saw in Nazi Germany, the men who were career military people in Prussia and in Germany. And it's like, do they fight for their country even though they don't like the leader? So it's an age old. I mean, I guess that's the thing I love about historical fiction, is so many of these dilemmas and human condition stays the same. The clothes change and the trappings, but people stay the same.
France has been in upheaval for 26 years while all this is going on. And as is true with most revolutions, although not ours, we were incredibly fortunate in the people who led our own revolution, George Washington in particular. All that burst of breaking down society and, seizing power and all the rest of it, they don't really know how to handle it. And so they wind up with an autocrat. And, the Russian Revolution, we got Lenin and then Stalin. The French had a revolution and then they got Napoleon. And then they lost Napoleon, and many of them missed that. They missed that, strong leader and wished them back. I remember, Candace, we were in Odessa in 2011, so times have truly changed. But I can, and also we've been in St. Petersburg a couple of times, and I can remember the older people actually missing Stalin, because their life was more certain. They had rules to follow. They were basically used to autocracy, and they were uncomfortable exercising choice and trying to do democracy. You can't just thrust it on people. I mean, we've tried that because we think it's such a great system, but in many of the places we have fought, we've learned that people not only don't welcome democracy, but have actually no idea how to run one.
Yeah, and there's also a sense of nostalgia for a past that might not have existed, or there was a lot of the nostalgia for Napoleon was they saw France as powerful, and then they were dealing with a king who was restored on his throne by their enemies, and so they wanted the days of gloire back.
Well, they were unlucky in that Louis XVI and Louis XVIII were the wrong kings for tumultuous times, just the way that Nicholas II was the wrong Tsar for Russia. And these were not guys who were savvy political leaders. They were more family men. They just weren't the people to steer a country through difficult times. But aside from all that, and honestly, if you are curious at all about what led up to the 100 Days, which is the Napoleon's escape from Elba to Waterloo in the spring of 1814, you should read this book. But let's talk about Sebastian, because he's been on a quest for a really long time to try to figure out what happened to his mother. And he's in France now with Hiro and his son and his adopted son, hoping to, to resolve this question.
Yeah, it was, I had wanted to write this book for a long time, and I was just sort of waiting for the political and the military situation to be ripe, that he could actually go to France and look for her, since I knew that's where she was. And then he had a son, who I could I wanted them to take the child with him. So it's not easy traveling in those days with a small child. So I had to let the kid get big enough to do it, all these considerations. But yeah, this is a book I've been wanting to write for a long time, so he could actually find his mother and what happened.
And not only does he take Hiro and his son and adopted son, but curiously, his father is there, because his father has a position in the British government. And then his father-in-law, his Lord Jarvis, his constant antagonist, is also there. So you were able to bring some of the characters to France also for perfectly reasonable, believable reasons.
Well, that was it. The aristocracy of Britain had used to go to Paris all the time, and they hadn't been able to for 25 years. So when that year of peace was in place, it was everyone who could went to Paris to see the fashion and just experience it, because they hadn't been able to go for so long. And so it was that's part of the book that is actually very realistic. It was believable for all those people to be there, because so many of them did go to Paris. And then suddenly Napoleon was coming back, and you could hardly get a carriage to get yourself out of there as fast as you could.
You also point out, which I think it's important to recognize, that Napoleon was a fabulous administrator. He reminds me of Henry II of England, actually, in that same sense. One reason, he was an inspired general, and he made a serious effort to make engineer changes in Paris and so forth that would make life better for people. And, looking at the sewer system, the water supply, how the government was run, and so forth. I mean, he really was a brilliant guy in that respect. And maybe that's one of the reasons the French, cut him some slack, despite the fact that that the loss of life for those people who fought with him was so horrific.
He was, and he was a very hands-on leader. If you look at the letters, the volumes of letters that were left, he would, people would send proposals to him, and he would read through them, and he would sit there at night and give his, his opinion. I mean, so many of the things, the metric system, that was all his idea. As you were saying, the sewers, the water. Paris was really badly lacking in water to the neighborhoods, and he put in all kinds of public fountains and pumps. He rebuilt the wharves and the markets. He was building bridges over the city, because he was putting a lot of money back into the people, and that the Bourbons had not done at all.
No, the Bourbons got carried away with life at Versailles, and which was a strategic mistake all the way around, because it moved them out of Paris, and they became more isolated and more, it reminds me of this whole current billionaire thing, with them migrating to, Mark Zuckerberg is going to work in wherever, Hawaii or something. And look at Boeing. Boeing got bought and transferred its administration to Chicago, whereupon the engineering part of Boeing really took a hit. And there was a really great documentary about it, but it's not at all uncommon for this kind of thing to happen. Now, one of the places we go in this book is Malmaison, which was Josephine's private estate to the west of Paris. And she was a terrific gardener. She was a Rosarian. You brought that word forward, didn't you? Because I don't think
I did. Yes. Yeah, because it was, and sometimes I feel like it's easier to to use a word a few decades before its time and just put a little note at the back saying this is a little early for usage. But and sometimes I wonder, maybe words were used and they just the dictionary didn't catch on to it. So yeah, but it was,
Absolutely.
I love roses myself, and so that was a fun part of it to write.
Sure. Well, there's a theme involved there. But when I was 15, I went to Europe for the first time. We went to Malmaison, and Malmaison and Versailles were still not in great shape because of World War II. Much of it was still shuttered. Most of the, furniture and so forth was still under safekeeping. But what I remember more than anything was there's display for Napoleon, not Josephine, but Napoleon. One, how tiny he was. I mean, I'm telling you, he was like 4'11" or something. And I remember looking at his uniform and thinking that, he looked like it was like a junior high school boy size. And another fact they brought out is he was one of those people that only needed maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. And so he was enormously productive because while other people were sleeping, he was traveling in his coach or he was whatever. But I mean, his work day was easily anywhere from 18 to 20 hours as compared to the average person, which is why he got such an incredible amount done.
Yeah, so like I said, sitting up at night answering all those the reports that he insisted being sent to him on everything that was being done in Paris, even when he wasn't there. And he couldn't have done that if he had to sleep like a normal person, because if you need sleep, you don't function well without it. And it's kind of
Very
important
true.
for
But we
him.
don't actually meet Napoleon in this book. He's out there as a moving threat, but we don't actually encounter him. Did you do that? Because I mean, was that just more fun to do it that way, or less trouble than trying to describe him up front?
Well, Hiro sees him at the very end when
Right.
he comes in, and they carry him up the steps of the Tuileries Palace on their shoulders. So she sees him. It was at that point I felt like it was kind of anticlimactic to the story, both the mystery of the murder plus the personal story that Sebastian was going through. So yeah, I felt like he was a threat coming, but yeah, we didn't need to actually see him beyond seeing him go up the steps of the palace.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that the fact that he was a looming threat adds a lot of, excuse me, adds a lot of tension to the book. And, it has a thriller aspect to it. But let's go back to Sebastian, Hiro, and the children and the nanny. Why have they come to Paris particularly?
Well, Sebastian has been looking for his mother for years, ever since he found out she's still alive, because he has a number of questions that he wants answered. And so since they've discovered that that's where she is, and the war is, at the time that they go there, has ended, he takes the family there so he can be there when she comes back. She's not actually in Paris. She's been in Vienna and she's on her way back.
So discovering that he'd been lied to for much of his life by his father and I think his sister, isn't Amanda also?
Yeah.
Right, because she's quite a lot older. He is the third son and fourth child, but the two older boys have tragically died. One of them drowns in Cornwall or somewhere like that, right?
Yeah.
And I can't remember what happened to the other one. Did he catch
He
something?
died of a fever
Right.
the summer that his mother was supposed to have drowned in a sailing accident. The other brother died of a fever.
So here's Sebastian, a third son, never, I mean, might have been destined for the army of the church or something. And all of a sudden he's the heir to the earldom, which is a really big thing. I don't know if we want to give away why it's a particularly difficult thing. Maybe we should skip over that. What do you think?
I don't know. It's he had originally intended to go into the army, and when he had the big blow up with his father when he was in his early 20s, he did go in the army. So he spent 6 or 7 years at war, And that does definitely mold who he is, gives him the skills that he needs, and also just I think that the temperament that he needs to do the things that he does in the series.
Well, it definitely gives him the skills because you have him in a number of pretty deadly fights, and he obviously learned, combat in the army. I'm glad that he did so well. I mean, it's touch and go here and there whether he's going to survive at all, but there he goes. And I was happy that Hiro was never under any really direct threat but she's a tough cookie, and she actually was a pretty good shot, which turns out to be a good thing. So there we are. Anyway, they arrive, and his mother has a small estate. This is when people could still have houses in the city that had actual gardens, and everything wasn't paved over the whole bit. So it's an older part of Paris near the Pont Neuf, which is in French means the new bridge, but it's actually the oldest bridge in Paris. So we'll leave that. And so what happens? What's the instigating incident here?
Oh, well, he and Hiro have been staying on the Université, waiting for his mother to come back, and he's out walking one night, and he sees a woman laying at the tip of the island beneath the bridge. So he goes down to investigate, and it's his mother. She has been she's still alive when he finds her, but she dies shortly after that. So his mother is the murder victim that drives the mystery for the book.
I have really mixed feelings about that. I mean, part of me thought, how cruel of you, Candace. And then part of me thought you couldn't really write the book if she were alive. So did you give any real thought to, the fact that she's murdered? I don't mean that you did it casually. I mean, but did you contemplate that the story needed to begin with that?
Actually, at one point I had thought about having her have been dead, and he discovers that. But then I thought, no, I wanted him to see her one last time and for her to see him. But I have always planned to have her be the murder victim that he was going to have to solve, mainly because, I mean, she's alive. There are some things she knew that I didn't want him to learn yet. And it just didn't seem wrong for her to be hiding them from him if she were still alive. So that's why she had to die.
That's the cruelty of the novelist. You're God in your own books, so you can do that if you want to. In fact, she's been stabbed, as well as there's some question about whether she died from being thrown off the bridge because she has a head wound, but then it turns out that she's been stabbed. And one of the things you do, I thought was really interesting, and that Napoleon had done, is he established a central morgue in Paris. And so that comes into play. Was that something that you knew all along? Did you have to look that up? Because it's really a very interesting part of the book.
I did know that. So I knew I wanted to work that in there, because it's an enormous contrast to the situation in France. I mean, in London at the time, when they just had those very crude dead houses that they used to send people to. Whereas Napoleon, once again, this is typical of him. They had no real system before he came along and said, oh, we need a central morgue, and he built it and he staffed it, and it was set up so that people could come identify bodies that were found or claim them. And it was very much ahead of its time. The thing that was particularly weird about it, though, is it was a tourist attraction. So they had all these dead bodies on display, and tourists would line up outside. It was actually in the guidebooks that, if you go to Paris, don't miss going to the morgue and peer at all the dead bodies on display. And that went on throughout the 19th century. At one point, they moved it to a slightly different building, but it wasn't until the 20th century that modern sensibilities came into play, and people said, maybe this isn't healthy. So they shut it to the public.
Well, but one aspect of it, which I thought was particularly interesting, is they would lay the body out on a slab, and then they would hang up the clothes that the victim was wearing. And part of that was hoping that somebody would come to view the body and ID it, because there were so many nameless or homeless people that died, that made it to the morgue. And, in its own way, it's kind of a it's almost like, you know, the Facebook crowdsourcing thing that they're doing today in true crime cases where, you know, or the little girl on the milk bottle or whatever you want to call it, you know, trying to enlist the public in identifying the dead. So, I mean, that's different than the tourism part, which I find really creepy. But, you know, people used to go to executions and take picnics and the whole bit. So it really wasn't, for the time, it really wasn't as weird as it sounds.
Yeah. Well, they also used to take wax impressions of the cadavers' faces, so that if they couldn't keep the body forever. So if it started going off, they would send the bodies to be dissected, and and then they would keep, I don't know how long they kept the wax impressions, but in case someone came looking for a person after the body had already been disposed of, they would have that they could identify. It was a very clever system that nobody else had at that time.
It was a clever system, but a holdover from centuries was, in fact, the public executioner, who is a character in this book. And he progressed from being the public hangman, or the, you know, the guy with the sword. I mean, Henry VIII, for example, when Anne Boleyn was beheaded, brought in a skilled swordsman from France who butchered it up, but nonetheless, that was the idea. But what we have now is the guillotine. And so you go into some history about the creation of the guillotine and the people that did it.
Yeah, I thought he was a fascinating character. The whole idea that you would have a livelihood like that is passed down from father to son, even when the sons did not want to become it. They were forced to become the next executioner. And while we see the guillotine and the thousands of people who were put to death as horrible, when you look at the tortures that they used to inflict on people in the process of killing them before the guillotine was there, and these were the same executioners that used to do that used to break people on the wheel and boil them alive, and all those horrible ways of putting people to death, that the revolution at least got rid of that. Then it sort of puts the guillotine in perspective.
Well, you actually portray it as more humane than previous methods of execution. And in one sense, that's true. It was fast, and most of the time it was very swift, and you know, didn't get bungled. I also, you know, where did you get the information that when the head is, I mean, this is going too far here, but it's a very small part of the book, but I thought it was really fascinating, that a head severed from the body can actually retain consciousness for up to 30 seconds. Is that really true?
That's what they said at the time, that that the executioner and his family and friends had actually done experiments where they would, this is horrible, they would cut off the person's head, and then they would like call their name, and the eyes would track towards them, and they would continue, and then they timed it, which is really incredibly ghoulish. And that was the conclusion they came to. I need to ask a doctor if this is really true, but that was the information that Sebastian would have gotten at the time, because this was the man who had done these experiments, the executioner.
This is early neuromedicine in his own way, exploring consciousness and what happens. Well, there's really no overt violence in the book. This is all, you know, sort of historical aside, so don't let us put you off. And Candace is also, I just happened to mention, she's capable, and often does, right, really sort of burning sex scenes, but there's no graphic sex or no nudity or whatever it all is. But, you know, I really like that, you know, that you approach these things so, what's the word I want? Forcibly, but you don't in any way offend the reader, because, you know, there's no ick factor on the page.
Well, I think I probably write the kind of books that I like to read. I don't like I don't like violence porn, which is what I always kind of see it as.
No, I don't like violence porn or sex porn. You know, the number of Regency novels that are just poor excuses for, you know, mild pornography really irritate me. And right, and you don't do that, but nonetheless, Sebastian and Hiro have a very intense and loving relationship. We also haven't mentioned that a long time back, Hiro's father and mother they were a ill-suited marriage. And so Hiro's got some issues with her father about her mother's death and her father's remarriage. So I feel sure that that's going to come back. And it's not in this book because the new wife is in London, but I feel sure that it will come back. So Sebastian's mission, once he has found his mother's body, which is horrific, is both to figure out who murdered her and why, but to figure out why she disappeared those years ago and what she has been doing. And we're not going to spoil any of that for you, but obviously you'd really given that an awful lot of thought before you wrote this book.
Well, I started writing the first Sebastian book, What Angels Fear, 20 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And I had thought about Sebastian and Hiro and Kat and Hendon and Jarvis for probably 2 years, maybe 3, before I actually started writing the series. And so I knew 20 years ago what had happened to his mother. That was all the backstory that I lived with for a couple of years before I actually started writing the first book. So yeah, I mean, there's still more that I have planned.
Oh yeah, no. We won't even go into what those are, but definitely there are many more things to be revealed, as we say. This is a real Regency era book. Lots of people mistakenly think that Jane Austen all the way up to like William IV or where, is Regency, but that's not true. It was a specific era in time when George III was deemed incompetent to rule because of his mental illness, which today people think was porphyria, but nobody knows for sure what it was. And so his son, who became George IV, was the regent during this period. But what was it, like 1810 to 1820, I think, are the actual years, isn't it?
It's early 1811 to 1820. And the first book, What Angels Fear, is set at the time of the proclamation of the Regency. And my idea is I'll just keep going until I get to the end of the Regency. So it will bookend it. Yeah,
well, but I mean, that's one reason it's so great that you can progress, like, starting a new book the day after the last one ends, because, and there are other people who've done that. Lindsay Davis wrote a wonderful series about Marcus Didius Falco, a Roman. Her second book takes place, I think it starts within an hour of the conclusion of the first book. Well, here we are in Rome, and everybody, why not? And that's one of the reasons I like historical fiction, is that we don't have to suspend disbelief about aging. We don't have to worry that the author is going to skip too fast through the period that we like, because the Regency is a very specific period in all kinds of ways, in fashion and in politics and in government and a lot, and it changes. So if we stay in it, then that's a measure, I think, of comfort to those who really like that period.
It's a fascinating period. It was an era of such tremendous change. If you look at the going from the 18th century, I mean, it starts a little bit, 10 years after the 18th century ends, but the first part of it is very colored by the 18th century. And then you go through all this turmoil of war and the Restoration and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And you're heading into, by the end of it, you're heading into the era of steamships, and the railroads are going to be coming soon. And the entire agrarian society with the post-Chase and four is very quickly going to go away. So, and it was such a dynamic era. It was so many brilliant people in art and literature, poetry, philosophy. It is a fascinating period. It's a lot more than ball gowns and duels at sunrise.
It reminds me of that period in Vienna right before World War I, where there was this tremendous concatenation of artists and other sorts of things. And oftentimes these incredibly productive and creative periods are fairly short-lived, or they come to an end because the changes that they instituted overtake them and call them off. But Georgian England was, as you say, it was rural. It was, the first banking system, for example, really came along with the South Sea bubble. I mean, that was the first instance of a stock market crash and all that stuff in 1720. And then, we got maritime insurance through Lloyd's of London, the coffee shops, because British ships were, out there on the high seas with goods, and people, didn't want their entire investment to be lost if the ship went down or pirates overtook it. And so, you wound up developing insurance, and, in other words, financial instruments really started emerging in the 18th century and carried over into one of my all-time favorite Georgette Hare books, because I'm sorry, but Georgette Hare to me, next to Candace, is like the goddess of the Regency novel, is a civil contract. And at the end of it, there's a character who has bet everything he has on the outcome of Waterloo. In other words, he's really gambled on the stock market, and it's either going to kill him or it's going to secure his finances and make life different and possible for him. So I like that. But one of the tragic things about the conclusion of the war was all the soldiers who came home, and there was nobody to take care of them. There was no provision for Sebastian's lucky, he was rich or came from a powerful and rich family, but there were an awful lot of people wounded in those wars that didn't have any safety net at all.
No, it was tragic. And that was one of the things that happened, with Napoleon, was that the Bourbons had let all the army go when they were starving in the streets. So when Napoleon came back, they all flocked to him. He got his army back right away because they were desperate, and they blamed the Bourbons, and they didn't blame him. And there's always that danger at the end of a war, if you too quickly release your army and without any kind of safety net, there's always a threat of revolution or some kind of a reaction because these are people who are used to fighting, and they're angry and they're hurting. So it becomes a problem in England after Waterloo.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I think I'm going to sneeze, which is why I'm doing this, but we'll carry on. Sorry. I beg your pardon. I am going to sneeze. It's pollen season here because the Palo Verdes are blooming, which is our version of dogwoods, and they're gorgeous, but they just expel pollen into the air. The Bourbons, you make it pretty clear that the Bourbons didn't do anything to endear themselves from their subjects once they were brought back and stuck on the throne. They apparently thought they could just revert back to the 18th century and not take into account all of the changes. Plus, a powerful figure is the surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, their daughter. And she is, at least in your portrait of her, just hell-bent on revenge. She's, always wears black. She's furious, she's bitter. She wants everybody to pay for what happened to her family. And all of those are reasonable emotions, but they're not a really good way to govern.
Yeah, her uncle, Louis XVIII himself was actually a fairly moderate man, but he was very lazy. He was not well. He was very old for his age. And if he had been stronger, I think he could have had more of an effect. But he was basically dying, and he was overpowered by his brother, who became Charles the 10th, I think it was. Can't remember now. And
I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the 10th, and Marie Therese. And they just they were so bent on restoring the ancien regime and the power of the church, and they didn't care that the people didn't want it, and they were so incredibly arrogant that it didn't occur to them, if French people rose up and got rid of them once, they could do it again, which of course they did in 1830. It's incredible arrogance. They just did not learn.
Well, it comes back to my point that they were the wrong people to govern at the wrong moment, just like Louis XVI was the wrong king to try to hold France together before the revolution, after was it his grandfather or his was Louis the 15th his great grandfather or his
Grandfather, yeah. It's
grandfather?
revolutions are very hard to control because they can
Yeah.
so quickly get out of hand, and people who are moderates and want a moderate amount of change can very quickly be overcome by people who have more radical ideas. I mean, that's what happened in the French Revolution. It happened in the Russian Revolution, and like you said, I always astounded that it didn't happen in the American Revolution.
Well, we were lucky,
very
I
lucky.
think, I used to live in Virginia, and we were very lucky that the men who were very powerful in the revolution were not the Boston excitables, but basically they were people who had estates and whatever, and had a stake in keeping things civil. I mean, they're much criticized today, for example, for being slave owners and so forth, but had they not been, it's very possible that they would have been far more radical, and we would have a very different country than we have today. They had a lot to protect, whereas so many people engaged in revolution, people like Robespierre or Fouché or something, they don't have anything to protect. Part of it is that they're on the make.
Yeah, that's true. And I also think probably the fact that and the colonies were such a rural society, and they didn't have those vast urban poor who could.
Right. Well, that's true. But I mean, if you look at Samuel Adams, for example, he was a real radical in Boston, but he, didn't wind up running things. So final thing I want to talk about is that there's a marvelous character, a real life character called Vidocq. And he has a fascinating history, but you bring him into this book. Did you know much about him before you wrote this book, or did you have a lot of fun unearthing him? I knew a fair amount about him, but I was fascinated with your take on him.
I knew about him, didn't know as much as I learned because I read a whole book on him, which he was definitely a fascinating character. He inspired a lot of fictional characters, people who have written mystery fiction since that time, because how much of it is true of his backstory and how much of it was just the image he built up, I don't know, but he was very brilliant, and his detection techniques were definitely an innovation at the time, and did have a lot of influence on down after him.
Well, he winds up being a major investigator, or he comes from the dark side as a criminal and perhaps on galleys and all the rest of it, and ends up working in the police. And I find him really fascinating. There is, as you say, quite a lot of literature about him. And I'm trying to remember how long do you remember how long he lives? We're only in 1814. Does he live as long as Edgar Allan Poe, for example?
I actually don't remember.
I should look it up. Patrick, look it up for me, will you please? Vidocq, Vidocq. And I'm thinking that he might have been an inspiration for Poe's early.
He was, yeah, he did influence Poe.
Right, and those were written in like 1842 or something. So I don't know whether Vidocq by then was dead and Poe, looked at his role, or whether he was still alive. But it's wonderful to think that it's like to set a thief to catch a thief is really what this was all about. But he had some of Napoleon's qualities too. He was a great administrator, great organizer. Thank you, Paris. Paris. Patrick, he actually lived to 1857, born in 1775. So he lived a long life. But in fact, he was alive when Poe was writing, and some of the early people writing crime fiction. And he was an inspiration, I think, for, there's a whole kind of subgenre of crime fiction, which we call written from the wrong end of the gun, but basically Larry Block's Burglar or whatever, where you have bad guys who nevertheless are kind of heroes in crime fiction, or they're not. And the question is, will they get away with whatever it is they're up to? what's his name? Lupin, which has been on television, Arsène Lupin. He's another character somewhat like Vidocq, and has had a more recent second life where we see him like burglaring the Louvre, or doing something fun. But anyway, he and Sebastian end up cooperating in this book in part, and so that's a lot of fun. There's so many things to love about this book. It's so rich. I'm going to reread it, which I almost never do.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with that book. I lived in Paris for a year when I was doing research because I used to be a historian, and so it was wonderful to get to revisit the city and to revisit it at the time that I had studied so much. And so, yeah, I poured a lot into it. It was great to get away from London, much as I love London too, where the series normally is set. It was really nice to get outside of London and within a.
So every April she publishes a new book, and I read it like the wind, and I love it. And then I think, damn, I have to wait all the way till next April to see what the next chapter will be. So thank God we're only in 1814 and we have 6 years to go. So, yay for
the next book is set at the time of Waterloo.
Okay, well then that's only 100 days.
Yeah, it doesn't progress very far.
So that's June, isn't it, of 1814?
It's June, it's June 18th.
So not all that long. Yay. Yeah. All right, Patrick, come join us, and we probably warn you and everybody else out here geeking along. Do we have questions, or do you want to make comments, or you just wish we go away?
Wow.
Did they come?
I'm muted. Yes, I went downstairs to check, and yes, they'd arrived.
Fabulous, because it's really a nice cover too, isn't it? I like it.
I like the blue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous blue.
Wow, how exciting. Now we can tell you for sure that we have signed copies of When Blood Lies in the store.
Let's see here. Okay, Linda would like to know, do you have a plan, or how many more Sebastian Saint-Cyr novels will there be?
I don't know. No, I don't know at this stage. I mean, I have certain ideas of stories I want to tell and events that I want to weave into the books, but like I said, when I originally started thinking about the idea, I thought I could cover the personal story arc in 8 books, and I realized that was really wrong. So yeah, I'll keep telling them until I get done.
Sure. Joyce asks, how much input do you have on your covers? She says, I literally bought When Gods Die when I spotted the gorgeous cover on the shelf. Then, of course, I fell in love with the characters and the plot.
They ask me for ideas, and they listen to me sometimes more than others. This particular one, they actually made quite a few different versions. I love the blue in that. This one, they had a yellow one at one time, they had a purple one. So I do get some input, but it's definitely their art department's covers.
Let me also point out a real shout out to her publisher is that the preceding 16 books are all still available in paperback.
Yeah.
Which in some long-term series is not the case, but Berkeley, yay Berkeley, thank you, has kept the whole series alive. So if you've not read one, you can read this one as a standalone, but you can go all the way back to the 2005 book and read your way forward.
I put a sampling of some of the paperbacks behind me here, and they're all kind of a nice design.
And they've changed
trade paperbacks.
They've changed the look of the series a couple of times, but then styles change in covers. So, and if you have that long of a running series, it's inevitably going to shift.
Is the top hat something that's historically accurate for that period?
It is. Sometimes they kind of exaggerate it a little bit, I think, but yeah. It's definitely.
This is the reason that there were American fortunes like the Vanderbilts and based on beaver, because these tall crowned beaver hats were in such demand that the poor beavers were slaughtered left and right to provide material for the hats, just like ostriches when at the end of the 19th century, they were a huge thing under Queen Alexandra, then ostrich blooms and all the rest of it. So the poor ostriches. It's amazing how fashion has impacted the natural world in various species when something takes root.
Yeah, it's sad.
Mandy has a question. She says, I love this series. Character development, plot, mystery, and action. Let's see, the historical validity. How do you decide what issues, there are so many, Hiro is going to address in the series?
Well, it's actually what I'm interested in investigating myself. A lot of it, part of it is what I feel that I can weave into that particular story. So it's a combination of what appeals to me and what I think works with whatever the murder mystery is in that particular book.
Hiro has a lot of freedom for a woman of her time. She has money, she's married, her father is very important, and she can therefore do things that a great many women would not be able to or allowed to do or wouldn't risk doing. She's not particularly afraid of blowback.
No, but she is still very careful that she doesn't, she knows where the lines are that she can't cross, and she is very careful not to cross them. And she is sometimes a little envious of women who just, like with Sebastian's mother, just say, I'm not playing this game anymore, and go do what they want. So, but she does still keep to those lines because a lot of it is obligation to family.
Yeah.
Let's see, little question about your research. Are you, I'm sure you know the period very, very well. Are you still finding things that surprise you in your research?
Oh, all the time, definitely. It's like, was it Rumsfeld who said, it's what you don't know that you don't know that hurts you. And so I'm always finding things that went, oh, that was wrong, and I didn't know it. But yeah, I'm always reading books about, like the one I'm writing now is about how a lot of it deals with how the news of Waterloo got to London. And it's sort of like the story of how Napoleon got from Elba to Paris. The news of how the story of how the news got from Waterloo to London is also very fascinating, and one of those things that we don't think a lot about. It's that's one of the things that fascinates me about this period. We're so used to instantaneous communication and knowing instantly what happens around the world, that to see, like the War of 1812, the United States declared war on Britain, and they didn't know it for like 6 weeks because it took that long for the ship to get there. That slow travel of news that they had to live with must have been really hard. We don't appreciate it.
Actually, one of my favorite things about the War of 1812 is the peace treaty was signed 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans,
Yes.
which made Andrew Jackson a hero. There was no reason to fight it except that nobody knew that the war had basically ended.
Yeah.
And when did they start calling the War of 1812 the War of 1812? Probably not that year, right?
I don't know that.
Interesting. And by the time the rest of the world learned of it, it was probably 1813. Yeah. So how did the news get there?
Oh, it's a very long, convoluted story. He sent Wellington sent one of his aides with it, but he didn't even send the guy till the next afternoon. Like, it was almost 24 hours before he sent the guy off, and then he took a carriage, then he got on a ship. But that was before the days of steam, and he got becalmed. So they sat in the middle of the channel, and finally they were close enough. They literally got in a rowboat and rowed.
They could have used pigeons, actually, which I think it turns out that carrier pigeons were a really important part of message carrying in World War I and World War II. In particular, there was an entire pigeon corps. Who knew? So I think that Mr. Jolly, in a civil contract, I'm trying to think of whether his news came to him by pigeon or by semaphore, but he did. That wasn't, it was Adam, not Mr. Jolly, but they found out before everybody else, which is how Adam scored his coup, his financial coup.
Well, they didn't have the semaphores because I was wondering why they didn't use the semaphores to send the information. And I've discovered that after they defeated Napoleon the first time, to save money, they got rid of the whole system. So it was not up and running when Napoleon came back and they needed it after Waterloo. It wasn't there anymore. They'd gotten rid of it.
There was a real lack of understanding about what might happen if they exiled Napoleon to Elba, and then they didn't pay him his stipend, and they didn't do things that allowed him to stay busy. And then the guy in charge of keeping him pinned up sailed away one day with plenty of notice, and so it was easy for Napoleon to, sail out after him and all. I mean, the British were responsible to a great degree, I think, for the fact that he came back to France. They just, failed to follow through. They got complacent.
Yeah, they didn't expect it to happen. It's one of those things that people just, if they don't think it's going to happen, they somehow or another can't wrap their heads around it when it does.
Let's see, any other questions? No, I don't think so. I think that about wraps it up.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being patient as I geek out, and Candace is kind enough not to do that. This, as I said, is one of my very favorite periods, and there are so many books that are set in the Regency, and it's hard to be discerning about which ones are in any way historically accurate and which ones are, romance or just for fun or something. But anyway, you can't do any better than to read this marvelous series about Sebastian St. Cyr and his long story arc. And I'm hoping that Candace, lives to be 100 and creeps her way towards 1820, because she has plenty of leeway here. I just want you to survive as long as I do, kiddo, because I don't want to run out of these books that talk about purely selfish here. Anyway, we do have autographed copies, and we have a few left. So please do purchase one. And I'm hoping, Candace, that we'll get to see you, if not next April, maybe even before then, depending on how things go.
That would be nice.
It would be nice. Maybe we'll have some sort of historicon or something at the Poison Pen in the fall, and we can invite a whole bunch of people. That'd be great. Anyway, good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.